Great. Casey, Ari, how are you doing?
I'm here.
Doing well. Nice hanging out with you in person, Jack.
We're going to try to make sure that we control our muting and unmuting so you don't get any unnecessary feedback. Well, thank you everyone for joining our webinar today on the fiscal year 2027 appropriations process. It's certainly been an interesting few months to kick off 2026. We started the year with a confirmed NASA administrator with the largest budget that NASA has ever had, or at least has had in the last 30 years, and a galvanized bipartisan coalition in Congress willing to continue to step up pressure primarily on the Office of Management and Budget to make sure that appropriated dollars become apportioned dollars and spent dollars by the space agency. And so we're really excited to be kicking off the FY 2027 process. So a couple housekeeping items before we get started. First off, this is a webinar. We are recording this for future use. And so, when we address questions, we will ideally read off the questions. So please, if you have questions, use the Q&A feature on Zoom. I will be monitoring the chat, but as with all these things, sometimes things get lost that way. So if you have a burning question, please send it through the Q&A function. Throughout the duration of this briefing, Ari, myself, and Casey will be here to answer your questions. I'll also make sure that I drop my contact information in the chat if you have any follow-up questions. And with that, Ari, Casey, anything else you want to add? Otherwise, we can get started. Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to kick it over to Ari, who is our AAAS Policy Fellow here at the Planetary Society, to get things going.
Well, let me first just say it's so great to see so many people here in this webinar expressing your interest in protecting NASA's budget and protecting science in this country during a challenging time. Whether you're a colleague in space science or policy or an enthusiast about space exploration, having your voice with us in this campaign to maintain science and exploration in this country, which has been the historic leader in space science, is really important and also really meaningful for the three of us. So I'm gonna dive right in to this talk, which is going to give you a little bit of an update on the current appropriations process. We're gonna define appropriations for those of you who haven't encountered that term before. And then we're gonna talk about a specific action you can take in the next few days to actually make your voice heard via a process called the appropriations request form. So Jack, if you go to the next slide, I'll just give a quick walkthrough. Like I said, we're going to start with just a definition. What is the appropriations process and why is it relevant to US science? Generally, how can you participate and advocate and be an active player in the process of democracy? And we're going to talk about this process called the appropriations request forms as a tool for advocating for NASA science. We're going to do a little walkthrough, and then there'll be time at the end for Q&A, whether you have any questions about that specific action item or about the appropriations process more generally. So if you go to the next slide, we're going to start really big picture. In order to understand what appropriations is, we need to talk about what the federal budget is. So this diagram is showing kind of three aspects of the US federal budget. There's the largest portion of this is called mandatory spending. So this is like your Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These are things that are written into law and taken from taxpayer dollars and have to be spent every year according to a certain increasing amount with inflation. Now, the part that is not mandatory, that must be reapproved by Congress every year, that's called discretionary spending. So that's the $1.8 trillion. And roughly half of that is defense, and half of that is non-defense. I know we're talking billions of dollars, so roughly half is not quite true, but just bear with me and look at the little sliver that is 25 billion. It no longer 25 billion, a little less in fiscal year 2026, but that little sliver, that's NASA's budget. It's paid out of a little tiny portion of the non-defense discretionary spending. And then the government also has to pay off interest every year. So if you'll go to the next slide, if we break that little sliver that we were just looking at further down into the different components of NASA that NASA spends money on, so that roughly $25 billion gets divided through space technology, low Earth orbit operations, deep space exploration, a little bit for aeronautics, and a large chunk, roughly a third, goes to science. What does that actually mean? Well, if we look at the next diagram, this is what that science money goes for. All of these missions. So you'll see NASA's heliophysics missions, Earth science missions in green, planetary exploration missions in purple, astrophysics missions, which is space telescopes and beyond in blue, and then the kind of little sibling, which is biological and physical science, which has largely been missions or experiments on the International Space Station. But there's so much here that fits within that science budget. And beyond just missions, if we think about even more, next slide, please. This NASA budget also supports a workforce of roughly 10,000 US scientists funded full-time as non-civil servant researchers, about 3,000 competitively selected grants each year. NASA is one of the largest funders of basic research in this country. And without that science mission directorate, we're left with a gaping hole in the process of discovery. So if you take us to the next slide, I want to talk about how all of that fits into Congress. So the US legislative process, this controls the spending, how much money goes into not just discretionary spending, not just NASA, but specifically science. That's our focus for this talk. And we need to think about, in order to understand how money is spent in this country, we need to think about the different chambers of government. Next slide, please. So as many know, there's three branches of government: the judicial branch, this is the Supreme Court; executive branch, this is the president and all of the executive branch agencies. NASA is one of them. But the president doesn't actually have the final say in NASA's budget. When it comes down to it, it's actually Congress. So that's the House and Senate. And Congress has the final say in what's called the power of the purse. The president makes suggestions via the president's budget request, but it's ultimately Congress that must debate and then decide how much money to spend on things like NASA science. And if you're calling in from anywhere but Washington, D.C. in this country, or maybe a U.S. territory, you have three representatives. Unless there's some fluke, like there's a vacancy in your district, you have two senators and you have a congressperson. And you have the right to reach out to your three representatives and tell them what you think about federal spending. Now, within Congress, next slide, Jack. The way that money is spent is broken down into 12 different components. And these don't necessarily always kind of like make sense, the groupings. This is just kind of like a grouping system that was designed to kind of make the bureaucratic process within Congress flow more smoothly. But what it's done is it's made it so that when Congress passes a federal budget each year, it passes it in pieces. Sometimes it passes it together in things called the minibus. This is what happened for fiscal year 2026. So there are multiple different circles here that were fit within one bill. Sometimes it's an omnibus, that's all of these different circles within one bill, or sometimes it's one at a time. And NASA fits within a grouping called Commerce, Justice, and Science. And so you'll hear us talking about CJS. So that's the CJS bill. It includes things like NASA, NOAA, NSF, a lot of the science that's done in this country. To talk you through where we are in that process now, after having gone through this big campaign last year, I'm going to pass it off to Jack.
Thank you, Ari. Oh, you're mute. There we go. Cool. All right. Benefits of working in an office together, right? So the appropriations process, it feels like it starts earlier and earlier every year, just like the holiday season. This is the nominal appropriations process, what you see on screen in front of you, starting really with what's called formulation and passback. That is when the Office of Management and Budget, which is the office within the Executive Office of the President that handles the federal budgeting process, they're the ones that draft the President's budget request in consultation with the agency. So passback is that final moment between which the OMB and the agency come together over what the budget request is going to be for the upcoming fiscal year. And this is something that starts really early in the process. And so like I have it here listed November to January. Really, this starts well before then. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some budget wonks over at OMB who are currently working on FY 2028 already. This is something that has to constantly be churning through the process because the federal government is as large and expansive as it is. There are so many activities. For NASA, this is something that, again, is part of the normal process. After OMB and NASA come together and finalize that budget request, it is then released by the White House to Congress and the American public. Typically in two tranches, you get what's called the skinny budget. This is a really big overview top-line document that looks at every agency within the federal government and gives it its overall top line. It's skinny because it's lacking a lot of details. This is like a 70 to 80 page document, and it handles everything from Department of Commerce and Department of Homeland Security all the way down to the independent agencies like NASA and the NSF. What comes after that is what's called the congressional justification, which each agency puts out, varies in size by agency. For NASA, that can be 400, 500 pages of detail. It is certainly not a skinny budget. It has all of the finer details that we're looking for about what missions and projects and programs are funded in the administration's sort of ideal version of the budget. That then gets transmitted over to Congress. They say thank you very much, set it on the desk, and start their own process whereby individual members communicate with the Appropriations Committee about their individual member priorities. Appropriations Committee hears from stakeholder organizations, trade associations, advocacy groups like the Planetary Society about what all these priorities are, and they take these tens of thousands of emails I'm sure they get over the course of just a few months, combine that into what the House and Senate create as their sort of counter proposal to the president's budget request. That then goes through that subcommittee process, right? NASA's in the CJS portfolio, 1 of 12. That then goes up to the full Appropriations Committee, then the full chamber, so the full House or the full Senate. They then go to Conference Committee, where they conference out all the details. That's where you get a select group of folks from the House, select group of folks from the Senate. They iron out all the details, send it back to the respective chambers for final passage, then over to the White House, all done by September 30th, right? Wrong. The last time that happened was fiscal year 1997, so 1996 was when that came to be. What the real appropriations process looks like is slightly different. We typically get some continuing resolutions as part of this, where we kick the can a little bit down the road so that Congress can finish all of that work, making sure that the budget hits all of the marks that it needs to, addresses all of the challenges each of the agencies face, and that it has broad bipartisan support. So I know we're in a very, very contentious, partisan, politics-driven situation typically on most issues. When it comes to federal appropriations, this is a largely bipartisan effort, as we saw with the passage of that minibus bill that included CJS earlier this year. So that is one of the, I think, hallmarks of the appropriations process, that it is typically a very bipartisan effort. And so where we are in this process is still towards the beginning of this timeline, right? We're still talking about, we still don't have the president's budget request. That is statutorily due the first Monday in February, but I don't think that has happened in many, many years, in the same way that regular order of appropriations hasn't happened in many years. However, the House of Representatives just last week introduced what they called their Appropriations Request Guidance. And that's important because that is further on in this process, right? That is the guidelines they create are basically the framework that individual member offices, these are the elected members of the House of Representatives, can submit their requests to the Appropriations Committee. Now, typically, this process doesn't kick off until after the president's budget has been released. It's happening earlier this year for some reason, obviously, but the House Appropriations Committee has already issued this guidance. The Senate has not introduced their guidance quite yet. So this is something that is only happening over on the House side of Capitol Hill. And so this is a way, and this is an open process for members of Congress through March 13th. So this is a very quick turnaround. This was announced last Wednesday on the 25th and is closing not this Friday, but the Friday after this on March 13th. And so that's a very short window of time in which member offices can submit their requests to the Appropriations Committee. Now that's where you can come in. That is where stakeholder organizations and advocacy groups like the Planetary Society are coming in to advocate for proper funding for missions and projects within the NASA Science Mission Directorate. So little reminder of what happened last year. So the final 2026 appropriation, that solid blue, where the solid blue line terminates, is roughly, still kind of on that downward trajectory in terms of inflation-adjusted budgets for NASA. Comparatively to the proposed budget, the FY 2026 President's budget request, this is a huge step above that, right? You see that FY 2026 proposed, it was a significant reduction, 24%, actually the largest ever proposed for NASA, and that includes in the years after the Apollo program was ending. The final budget deal that came to be in a bipartisan fashion earlier this year, although it is not adjusted for inflation, or an increase as would be necessary to adjust for inflation, it is still stable and flat funding from what we have in real dollars last year. And that is in large part because you and me and Ari and Casey and people all over the country and indeed all over the world voiced their opposition to this. And they said, hey, NASA is an important brand of the United States. This is scientific inquiry is an important element of technological progress and discovery, and that these are things that we, the United States as a nation, have led in the last 60 years. Landed people on the moon, sent spacecraft to every major body in the solar system, unraveled mysteries of the universe, and also increased economic prosperity through the technologies and investments that NASA has in basically every state, and certainly almost every congressional district as well. And so Congress agreed with us, right? That massive budget cut that was proposed was rejected outright by the Congress. We saw the first inklings of that actually last summer, the result of what we're talking about here, that appropriations request process. Enough members of Congress heard from people like you that this budget was unacceptable, and the House and Senate had proposed budgets last summer that largely rejected those budget cuts, but they weren't law yet. That's the second piece of this. But having that concerted support, right, around a specific funding number or just the idea of sustaining investment in something like NASA science goes a long way. And so that is a way that you can influence this process very early on. And so here's just a couple screen grabs that I had, staying up, making sure that these bills passed. This was the HR 6938, was that CJS minibus that passed out of the House January 8th, Senate January 15th, and became law on January 23rd. So obviously a huge bipartisan margin of victory, 397 to 28 in the House, and then over in the Senate, 82 to 15. And so you don't see those margins quite often these days. So it's really, really, hopeful and inspiring to see the Congress rally around funding like this. So what happens next? So obviously you have to implement that budget, and I referenced this earlier, making sure that those appropriated dollars become apportioned dollars, and those apportioned dollars can become spent dollars, is an important part of this process. And this will, NASA has to develop what's called a spend plan, which is then transmitted to Congress 45 days after enactment. That's next Monday, March 9th, is 45 days. And any issues with that spend plan are then influenced in sort of this informal fashion with Congress. That spend plan is still in formulation. I know some folks have been tracking this issue. There is some issues related to some funding pauses in place for NASA and for NSF and some of the other science agencies as well. But we understand that those are kind of going through this additional process to make sure that OMB is apportioning those dollars. Congress ultimately has that final sign-off for the spend plan, and so that's transmitted to them at the end of that 45-day period. They either give the thumbs up or request changes, and then that becomes the budget of the United States for the remainder of that fiscal year. And then concurrently with that happening, we spin up this FY27 process. And so, again, as a reminder, this is where we are in that process, sort of this really early, though we have had the House of Representatives introduce their appropriations guidance. So here's just a little bit of a status check as well. So the White House had issued a memo, or OMB had issued a memo last year about research and development priorities within the federal budget. We're going to be looking to see how those are ultimately reflected in the final budget request. We're expecting that the president's budget request, even though this House process is already underway, we're expecting mid-March right now for the president's budget request to come out, at the very least that skinny budget, right, with just those top-line details. And we're hopeful, based on the experience with FY26 and the damage that was done to our national scientific enterprise with all that uncertainty and the looming budget cuts, that spurs Congress to action quickly in the event that the president's budget is a proposal for another major cut, that Congress responds quickly and says, no, I'm sorry, that is just not appropriate. We have a lot to go off of just based on the way that Congress responded to the cuts last year. So I think I'm going to throw it over to Casey if you want to share the appropriations request dashboard. So this is a new tool that we're launching right now in this webinar that allows you to see these appropriations request forms for your member of Congress. And remember, this is a part of the process for the House of Representatives is only open for these next 2 weeks. And so this is, we'll say, an extra step of advocacy you can take is filling out these request forms to your member office, right? They're receiving input from stakeholders, from various other outside groups, and from constituents like you, that they're then going to ingest and submit their formal request to the Appropriations Committee. And so it's your way to be a part of this process. And so you can have a direct line to what budget ultimately gets passed by participating in this process. Casey, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Thanks, Jack. I will see if I can share my screen, which is always a fun opportunity to do live, but we will get there. Here we go. Yes, so I wanted to walk through this new dashboard that Jack mentioned. And Jack, you can see this?
Indeed, I can. Looks great.
Okay. So nothing beats the thrill of coding up a dashboard in about 24 hours, which this is. But this is our time is short, and this is actually a good example of our following up on last week's webinar of AI-assisted software development and rapid prototyping and tool creation. But so we have a couple of options for you, and I'll be rolling out more data this today. But we have filling out these appropriation request forms can sometimes be very technical. They can use terminology that's not familiar, and functionally be relatively intimidating when they're really not at their heart. And particularly, what we're asking for this year is really focusing on the NASA science top line. So we tried to think about ways that we could help you if you're a constituent of a certain district that is accepting input right now to walk through with some basic information, context that you can use to then frame it with your own experience and own perspective in order to kind of take this really important advocacy action. So Jack shared the URL. This is rolling out literally right now. We'll have more detailed data coming out today, but we have you can just select your representative and your state, and most people will have a generic walkthrough that'll kind of walk you through some basic points of information. Um, that's the default. So if you have, what appropriation subcommittee you're looking for, what federal agency, obviously NASA, what account, titles, things like that, just kind of basic structure. It's a generic walkthrough that helps get you through most of it. We give you example talking points. We give you example funding history of NASA science if that is requested in the uh, particular congressional appropriations request. Now, what the interesting thing is that we're kind of rolling out today in the beta mode is that for a select number of congressional offices, which you may be one, um, and I'll pull up here an example of Texas 20. We actually are integrating our NASA contract and science awards database, so you can actually see when you're filling out this information how much spending has been done by NASA science in that given district over the past 3 fiscal years, the total number of active NASA contracts and their potential value, total value, and number of grants. You can browse through a whole number of them with more detail if you want to create and build out a more expressive and detailed argument. But what we've also done is leverage some of our AI tools to kind of go through crawl through the specific field forms themselves. Where we have this information, we have, let's see, right view, the link directly to the congressional office's appropriations request form. And the idea is that we will have for every item requested here specifically, we will give you the kind of the suggested response for that item, which will help you again kind of walk through this, like again, tuned specifically to the appropriations request form of this member. So obviously filling out your personal information is very straightforward. We give you kind of our organizational information and Jack's contact information if they request that. But here, for example, we have select subcommittee dropdown. It says to select Commerce, Justice, Science. Request type here, it tells me to select funding request. And then it actually opens up a number of subsequent fields that we provide you then answers for. So NASA, Science Mission Directorate, and then kind of going down here, we even give you kind of a starting point as bullet points. So further down, there tends to be provide explanation for why this request for NASA science is relevant to our district. And so we actually integrate that NASA award data for science and give you some starting talking points that you can then fill out and start to build out yourself. So this is actually pulling real data from the USA spending information contract database. It's framing it with some of our broad talking points perspective, and then you can use that and then build that out yourself, or just use it as an inspiration for how you frame something as being relevant. This district's pretty easy sell because they have hundreds of millions of dollars of active contracts from SWIRI in this district. Something that we also give here is kind of a confidence measure in terms of how confident the AI was in its response, so you can kind of tune your response to that. As always, with with our policies, we tell you this is an AI generated guide, so to kind of validate this information, but we give you its reasoning here if you need to figure out why it's confident or not. But at the end of the day, you yourself have this information, the actual contracts, the actual grants, the actual spending. That is fixed. That is not AI generated. That is real data, and you can kind of frame it yourself. Um, so this is basically a way to help walk you through entering and creating the most effective response that you can. I'll emphasize that you do this as a constituent of their district, which is why they ask for your personal information here. In addition to that, we will be rolling out kind of more detailed information and updates, as many of these as we can. Some of these, every congressional district request, and this is also important, isn't as easily read as Joaquin Castro's here. We have a variety of offices will require you to email them to request the document. Some will give it as a Word document. Some will give it as uh, a PDF file, right? So it's not always the easiest thing to do. We can't walk you through every single possible variation because they're wildly inconsistent. But at the end of the day, you can always go back and for any office, and we'll be rolling out more Word and spending information for all these later today. You always have our general kind of framing and starting points for how to answer these types of questions. So that is a tool that is just rolling out now today. We'll be rolling out more advanced analysis for more offices as the day goes on today, as we process through some of those. But this is, again, I think a great example of how we can leverage some of these AI tools to not replace what you're doing, but to make it a lower energy barrier for you as an advocate, to be more confident in your responses and to help break down some of those information barriers between you as a constituent and your right to communicate your interest and desires for space science spending. So happy to take any questions later about that, or online. You can contact me. Everyone knows where to find me. And Jack, I will turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Casey. Really impressive turnaround on getting this. So kudos. If you missed our AI and space advocacy webinar from last week, that is up on planetary.org. Really amazing stuff that Casey's been able to put together in a very short period of time.
Yeah, literally 24 hours.
I should mention the reason this had to be such a sprint, if you didn't notice, is because many of the representatives in the House have deadlines of this Friday. So if you're on this call and you're like, yeah, this is a great idea, I'll get around to it this weekend. No, these are going to be due on Friday night.
Yeah, and
so
we have
if you
those
really,
deadlines as much as possible in there.
yeah. So if you really want to maximize your impact in this effort, it's going to be going in today, tomorrow, or Friday.
Yeah, and so that's I think I saw a question in the Q&A feature. Again, remember, use the Q&A feature to post questions that you'd like us to answer. I saw a question in there about like what the quick turnaround is, and it's that appropriations request process. And so this is one step of many that happens between now and the budget actually getting enacted, but it is a very important step because it is how members of Congress determine what their priorities are, right, in the budget. And so they're going to hear from not just space advocates, but from advocates across every sector of government, every level of spending, everybody. There are advocacy groups, though the Planetary Society certainly is unique. There are advocacy groups and trade associations and professional societies across all of the various activities of government. And so this is something that the citizenry, the denizens of these areas, these congressional districts, can get involved in. And so you should feel totally comfortable as a constituent of these members to be part of this process. Now, I dropped into the chat. If you are not familiar with your congressional district, and I know in certain states the congressional district lines may have changed recently, you're going to want to check that. There is typically going to be some question about, are you a constituent of this member of Congress? If you're not a constituent, typically they will still receive that input, but constituent voices are very important for members of Congress, especially when determining funding priorities. Great, so I can I guess I don't really have too many. I have no other slides that have any useful information other than just to initiate our Q&A. So I think we can start again. If you have questions, throw it into the Q&A feature. I'm going to start looking through right now to see if we have any particularly good ones. First one we get is, can you please make available to members the budget graphics and diagrams? That is a great question. Actually, a lot of these resources exist on our website at planetary.org/save NASA Science. I think maybe one of our top performing. Oh yeah, Casey just dropped it into the chat. All of our charts live on our website, and so all of that. Casey, you probably want to talk a little bit about how they're made, but really an amazing resource for what's available.
Yep, sorry, I was pasting at the same time. It's planetary.org/charts. Has most of them. I will drop it in here. And then on, yes, the Save NASA Science and our NASA budget guides has those as references. All of our new charts automatically provide you, people often miss this feature, but they have like a download options link that will provide high quality print ready vector graphic versions, PNG quality versions, mobile and widescreen desktop versions, in addition to the source data as a CSV file. Again, if you caught our webinar last week about AI-assisted policy development, that is another tool that we created in order to rapidly package and share our critical budget data and context analysis in ways that just make it easier to use both on mobile and desktop versions. So a lot of those are on charts, and then Save NASA Science, and also the NASA budget sections on our website right now. If you can't find something you know exists, let me know. I'm actually going through and updating a lot of those charts in preparation for fiscal year 2027.
Great. I'm going to put in our general email address in here. advocacy@planetary.org. It's the best way to get a hold of any one of the three of us. All those emails come to us. So please, if you have any follow-up questions. I did see one question that was maybe pertinent to the request forms I wanted to address in the chat here, about what funding level should we request, and I think I maybe a faux pas on my part, maybe taking a couple steps back. So we at the Planetary Society, as well as a lot of our partner organizations, including the American Geophysical Union and several other of our partners, are advocating for a Science Mission Directorate budget of $9 billion. Now, $9 billion, why that? One, we have been asking for that funding level for the past 3 years in a row. That is a slight increase, about a 4% increase over the inflation-adjusted peak funding level for NASA Science. So back in fiscal year 2020, NASA Science received its largest budget when adjusted for inflation. It was roughly about $8.7 billion. And so $9 billion is just slightly more than that, and reflects an increase in investment in that. And so that is where the science community has come together to support the NASA budget. And so even within NASA Science, there are various other elements, including Planetary Science Division. That's your planetary spacecraft, the Dragonfly, Veritas, Da Vinci, heliophysics, study of the sun, astrophysics, typically your space telescopes and ground-based observation, earth science, looking back down at us, and biological and physical sciences, which is the newest of the five, actually just recently got their decadal survey, and that's primarily, as Ari noted, the instrumentation and experiments on the International Space Station. Though there are some going up with Artemis II, in particular the Avatar mission. So there is a lot happening over at BPS. So across all of those, and then of course you have your Office of STEM Engagement, though not a part of NASA Science in the org chart, is an important element within the overall science enterprise. So,
and we'll put, I'll say we can put up some of this context and maybe even reference the upcoming letters and other things for the NASA 9 billion on the landing page of the dashboard too. So I'll take that as a to-do to add that shortly as soon as we have that information.
Yep, because yeah, that's going to be the thing, right? That we're asking for, and ultimately, and I do want to be clear, like 9 billion is a big ask when your budget is currently we're at 7.25, but this is something that the science community, the advocacy community, is all aligned on. We have been for years, and actually, we have members of Congress who are advocating for that 9 billion number. Actually, just launched today is a letter that the co-chairs of the Planetary Science Caucus, the only caucus in Congress dedicated to advancing space science, they launched a letter today. That's Congressman Don Bacon from Nebraska and Congresswoman Judy Chu from California are the two co-chairs. And actually, if the appropriations request is maybe a step too far for you, or you want to do something even more, you can actually send a message to your elected official to encourage them to sign on to that letter. Because the more members, so we're kind of taking this multi-pronged approach to the FY27 appropriations process. And so there's a couple different advocacy routes. Again, that dashboard for the appropriations request, very important. Please, if you can, do that and do that quickly so we can make these deadlines. And then also this letter is very important because it will show. Last year we had 83 signatories. That's 83 members of Congress, more than have ever stood together on NASA science requesting that $9 billion, because we did that last year too. This is yet another attempt to push the science budget. So do you want to know, there was one question in here, is there any language that would support the analysis group efforts? So what that's referring to, the Planetary Science Division, up until actually this coming April, had funded what are called assessment or analysis groups. Unfortunately, as is in the discretion of NASA, is rescinding that funding effective at the end of April. So that is a decision that NASA itself can make. The funding request does not include anything specific about assessment groups. This is, again, we're talking a top line number that includes all of the activities within the Science Mission Directorate. Outside community input is very important. That's why we have things like the decadal surveys. That's why we have the AGs, right, as we colloquially refer to them as. So unfortunately, that is an activity covered under the broad umbrella of NASA science, but the sort of future role of the AGs is still yet to be determined. So it doesn't, sorry, that's kind of a long answer to say it doesn't directly address that, but we're talking about that big picture of NASA science right now. See a great question in here. Does anyone know if a NASA Roses call is tied into the same FY budget, fiscal year budget?
I can...
And ROSES stands for Research Opportunities for Space and Earth Science.
Good job, Jack.
There we go. Gotta love those acronyms.
Yeah, no, that's a 5-letter acronym too, not even a TLA. I can jump in just a little bit on this one. ROSES this may be a bit technical for some audience, so I'll just kind of rush through this one. But ROSES is complicated in terms of a fiscal year appropriation because most grants pay out over the course of 3 to 5 years. And so when they do selections, they're projecting not just the money they have this year, but whether they can carry those funding years forward for the next 2 to 3 years. And so when there's a big disparity between the president's request and the current fiscal year, in terms of having a better budget, they can say, well, we could this year pay for 20 grants, but next year we could only pay 5 of them, right? And so that limits or makes it more challenging to kind of accommodate how they're going to pay ongoing, the commitments they already have and then selecting new ones. And so that rolling window of grant payouts mixed with uncertainty on the year-to-year basis is part of the challenge and why I think ROSES has really been delayed and hit. And what we saw last year was ultimately because of that, they actually pre-funded a number of selections that they did make with the money they had, which made it easier for them to continue funding their existing commitments in this year. But yes, it's not a good situation, obviously, but that's a it's a structural challenge of how they pay out grants.
That's a good segue. I'm also seeing there's a series of questions here about how different funding lines interact and maybe take away from one another, that it's worth clarifying. And Jack and Casey, feel free to jump in if I miss anything here. But I'll just start with the first one, which is talking about the boundary between NASA's science budget and exploration budget. Those are two distinct boundaries. So the Artemis program is not part of NASA's science budget. So when we advocate for NASA's science budget, it's on top of that. There is some intermingling. There are science components and science payloads that go up with Artemis that are paid out of the science budget. But the overall architecture of the mission is out of a fully different funding line than science, and they don't take away from one another. Similarly, there's another question about how HR1, or the big beautiful bill that passed last summer, how that may have helped support NASA science. So there was not specifically any money in that for NASA science. There was money in there for exploration and aeronautics, and the SLS vehicle. And some of that money, it sounds like, according to Administrator Isaacman, is going to be used towards supporting NASA's workforce. But beyond that, it's not specifically being used for science. So when we advocate for science, it's fully separate from that pot, which helped NASA in other ways. And then third, there's another aspect here, which is kind of prescient in this moment, which is how might geopolitical events going on right now be affecting NASA's budget. I will say national security and defense comes out. Remember when I showed those 12 circles of the appropriations committees, that comes out of a fully separate circle, a fully separate committee, appropriations subcommittee than the Commerce, Justice, Science Committee. So there's not kind of like a direct relationship between those two things. Obviously, there are societal trends that can affect how the appropriators think about funding different things, but it's a really complex topic that's starting to get into human psychology, and it's just not something we can predict.
I can add a little context to that, Ari. If anyone is old enough to remember the Iraq War era, like myself in around 2006, 2007, it is indirect consequences sometimes, because if there is significant ongoing expenditures in things like defense, it starts putting just overall pressure on the debt. There will be sometimes a pressure to reduce non-defense spending to, make up for that. So NASA's Constellation program ran headlong into that, despite large initial proposed increases in 2004 at the announcement of Bush's vision for space exploration. Ultimately, none of those really came through due to other spending priorities, mainly due to Iraq in the mid 2000s. So if this goes on for a while, we could see a similar context, but as Ari said, it would be indirect and kind of the result of larger trends in terms of, how much more the national political system is willing to tolerate growing deficits. I see a question here, Jack, about working with AAS and AGU. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I had responded in chat, but yeah, that's
Okay.
that's good call. Yeah, so AAS and AGU, some of our best partners on these asks. We're working very closely with them, as well as a number of other professional societies and trade organizations and other folks. So again, we launched that Save NASA Science campaign last year. We had more than 20 organizations across all of the different activities that we were involved with, and really kind of started as a coffee check-in with our friends at AAS and AGU, and blossomed into this fantastic campaign. So we do work very closely with our friends over there. I see a great question in here about where in the process will we be during the April Day of Action. So the Planetary Society's flagship advocacy event, the Day of Action, is happening April 19th and 20th. Registration is still open if you're able to come to DC for that. Still kind of unclear where we're going to be. So obviously the House moving forward with their appropriations request process indicates that they're moving quicker than they have in the past, but we're still missing that president's budget request. And I did see in the chat here that we got a note that the PBR is not expected until the week of March 30th. So that is kind of new information for me. I'm sure I missed it somewhere in one of the many newsletters, but that's really late in the process for that to be coming out. So Day of Action is going to be very much responding to that budget request and ensuring that Congress knows that the general public is enthusiastic about a strong and robust funding line for NASA science, not paring back our ambitions. Let's see. I see a question in here. Do we have any detail about other areas within NASA for spending requests? I can take a little bit of that. Casey, Ari, feel free to jump in. So we're obviously focused very heavily on the science portion. That is the thing that has been under the most scrutiny in the budget request process over the past year and a half. We are, however, work closely with a number of other organizations, Coalition for Aerospace and Science, which has their requests as well for those mission areas. All of them seeing a plus up. So that might be a good resource for us to put out on the website as well as the request numbers for those areas as well. But I will admit I'm not as well versed in space operations and aeronautics as I am in space science and exploration. Great. Do we have any other really good questions? I'm seeing some activity in the chat. Want to make sure that we're getting. Is 9 billion, a great question in the chat, is 9 billion the highest NASA science budget ever? Yes, that would be. Adjusted for inflation, it is only slightly higher than that peak funding amount, like I said, in fiscal year 2020. At the time, the real dollar amount was somewhere in the high $6 billion, if I remember correctly.
Doug, I hate to break it to you.
Oh no!
As inflation has changed over the years, the highest point seems to be like 1999. Inflation adjusted about eyeballing it here, 9.8 billion.
Well, see, then it's a bargain, right?
We all learned something today.
Well, no, that's great context to
It's
have.
the highest of this century, and of the local kind of maxima would match that. That was a peak of not just earth science, but heliophysics was one of at its peak around then. And right at the start of the big initiative, sending robotic spacecraft to Mars too. So I think a lot of that was encompassing that. Ironically, at the end of the better, faster, cheaper era, NASA science had its highest budget ever.
Great point.
Did you want to address the question about the caucus, Jack?
Yeah, that was actually the next one. So
I was going to say, name me a larger planetary science caucus.
Yeah, there is. So there's a question in here, again, talking longer term about the Planetary Science Caucus. So noting that it is relatively small relative to the whole body of Congress, right? 435 members in the House, 100 members in the Senate. The caucus is the largest it's been in recent memory. It's that local maximum. The caucuses are an interesting feature of the U.S. Congress. They're more pronounced in the House than they are in the Senate. The Senate doesn't even have a formal caucus organizing process. Typically, members of the Senate that are interested in a topic join a House caucus, and they're just the Senate, patron or Senate lead for that caucus. And so, yeah, growing the caucus is a top priority for us. We're very proud of the work that we've done so far to build it to the point that we had not just the caucus members that are currently on the caucus, but an additional 60 plus more members that joined our appropriations request last year. And so it's not necessarily caucuses kind of have like a weird thing. Some members join every caucus that they can. Some members are very judicious with it. And so it really just depends on the personality of that office and of that member. Just because someone's not a member of the caucus doesn't necessarily mean that they don't align their values or interests with that of the caucus. We just like to have, more members if possible. So yeah, in terms of long-term building, building those coalitions with folks on the Hill is a big part of the job that Ari and I are doing here in DC, that our member donations and generous support from folks around the country helps enable. And so that is always going to be a priority for us, is growing the caucus. Great question in here. I know we're at the top of the hour, so I'm going to do this one. And then if folks have more, I'm happy to stick around. Casey, Ari, I don't have to keep you, but you're more than welcome to stick around. But there's a question in here: how are decisions made about individual programs, and in particular missions like our sample return? I think that's a hot topic right now, given that the state of MSR, as MSR, one of those TLAs, three-letter acronyms, Mars Sample Return, as a program office, is intended not to exist anymore. In the FY26 budget that passed and became law, it said that the Congress no longer supports MSR as currently formulated, but supports the idea of MSR. Those decisions, right, about what happens with specific programs, it's sort of a dance between congressional direction, right? So you look at, for MSR, right, that direction to say, hey, we don't like the way that this program is going, please reformulate, please find a better way to do this. Or we specifically like this program, so if you look at things like the Habitable Worlds Observatory, which got $150 million in the budget negotiation. You look at Veritas and Da Vinci, which collectively got about $100 million in the final budget deal. Neo Surveyor, Osiris, Apex, Juno, New Horizons, those things are all line items in the congressional budget. Now, I will say, if you are very much a big fan of those, make sure to mention those in your appropriations request, or make that as part of your communication with Congress, because they want to know not just that top line number, but what are the things that inspire you. And we at the Planetary Society are excited about all things space, right, across the broad portfolio in science. But certainly you as a constituent, as someone who cares about this, or maybe even potentially works in these fields, might have a mission or two that are of particular interest. And so making sure that you're also talking about what those things are, so that your member of Congress knows that, hey, there's a team member from such and such mission in my district, or there's somebody who really cares about Venus science, or habitable worlds beyond our own solar system. Like there's ways that you can talk about these things as part of the overall ask. And so I encourage you to, as much as possible, personalize these messages to your member of Congress, because that, one, helps get it read by a member of the staff or the member themselves. And it makes sure that when that member's making making a submission to say, I care about a $9 billion top line for science, and within that, my people, my constituents really care about these missions, can help push the needle on when the Appropriations Committee is writing that bill and they're looking for things to have line items for, can help frame where those interests lie. Great. Let's see, is any other questions in here? Oh, great one in here as well. Again, if you have to head out at the top of the hour, please feel free to do so. This recording will be posted after the fact. Great question in here. How can we show support when we don't live in the U.S.? One, if you have any U.S. colleagues, sending them this webinar, sending them the resources that we have on our website is a great first step. to doing that. Obviously, that is not you taking that action. That is having folks submit things that they may share that interest with you, and connecting them with these resources. And I would also say stay involved and engaged with the Planetary Society. Last year, one of the things that we did was we had launched a global petition to support NASA science. We had community members, about 3,000 people from over 100 countries add their name to that, and they were specifically highlighted as a part of a larger group of about 22,000 people who were, staking their putting their name out there to say that they care about science, and that information was transmitted to Capitol Hill and the folks at NASA. And so that is, we've done that before. I'm not going to guarantee that we're going to do another petition, but if you stay engaged with us, we are constantly looking for ways to engage folks in the international community, because it is an important element of any space program nowadays, right? There is always international participation. And so just stay engaged with us, wait for those opportunities, and where possible, share what we are doing with folks that you may know in the United States who can be a part of this. Anything else you'd like to add on that, Casey, Ari?
That was a good response. It's always a persistent issue, particularly for these types of U.S.-centric political stuff that's obviously consuming quite a bit of our time. Yes. Well, again, as Jack said, we're easy to find online, and hope to see many of you in Washington, D.C. Next month, 6 weeks from now, give or take. And I will be updating the dashboard throughout the next day. As Jack and Ari emphasized, it's good to just kind of check deadlines for submissions. Not every House office or Senate office is accepting requests as well. So it's a bit of a scattered process. So the thing that you can do for sure is fill out the online action that Jack mentioned, and then check the dashboard and see if there's ways to take additional work, additional advocacy work to really help make a difference for NASA science.
Great. Well, Ari, Casey, thank you. Ari, any last words?
Just again, reiterating, thank you all so much for being here. Even if you're just here to learn about the process, you are taking the first step in doing the duty of participating in democracy and championing science. And if you take the extra step of going out and filling out one of these appropriations request forms, we really, really appreciate it. So thank you all for being here. And thank you to my colleagues, Jack and Casey, for helping make this possible.
Thank you all.